Okay, good morning. My name is Dr. Hackett, and I am your instructor for the whole semester. What I wanted to do today is I wanted to put together a video, both introducing myself, but also kind of going over some aspects of Unit 1, and this might not be the only video for Unit 1. Okay, so first off, the question that we're posed at the very beginning of every philosophy course is exactly how to discuss or introduce topics in philosophy and what the subject of philosophy entails to people who may have never actually studied or read any philosophy. So this is a pretty big challenge. Philosophy is so big. One thing you should remember is that philosophy is 2,500 years in the making and still being made today. So what that means is that there's 25 centuries of history of this subject matter. And in fact, Plato invented the first university called Plato's Academy, which is, that Greek word academy relates to academics and academia today. Now, to introduce philosophy, usually what I do in my own intro courses is I write on the board. I say, philosophy is the intellectual use of the imagination to solve problems that cannot be solved by faith, common sense, or science alone. Although philosophy will involve dialogue with common sense and with faith and with science. So, for instance, you'll get areas of philosophical concern and research into something called philosophy of science, which asks questions about method and knowledge that scientists don't ask. It'll ask, what is the status of a scientific model? And what can science know? So it'll get philosophical, or in gamer term, it'll get meta about that domain of inquiry called science. We have something called philosophy of religion. Philosophy of religion can rightly be understood historically as when Greek philosophy kind of influences and develop ways of justifying our belief in God. So for some, faith might not just be mere belief in the strength of one's faith, but one might want to give an argument for God's existence, which would involve metaphysics. So philosophy of religion is often the epistemological and metaphysical concerns of religious faith. That being said, we haven't really gone over that vocabulary to introduce that to you, but in your introductory readings, you're starting to hear these words. Philosophy is the love of wisdom. It combines two Greek terms, philia, which is the fraternal sense of love, a familiar sense of love, and Sophia is wisdom. It can mean moral wisdom. Practical reason in Greek is sophrosune, which comes from sophos, right? We get the word Sophia. So someone wants to name their daughter Sophia. That's really, they're naming her for wisdom itself. So philosophy is the love of wisdom. And we use our imaginations to gravitate towards what we might call ultimate questions. Now, ultimate questions are the highest forms of questions that one can ask. All right, and they're at the basis of all, if not most, scientific discourses, right? So, and other discourses in the university. So you might say, for instance, I lost my train of thought. Hang on. Okay, what is real? In science, again, return to philosophy of science, what is the metaphysical reality that the models that we use in explanation? Philosophy of science will ask questions like, what is explanation? Everyone in science assumes that nature can be explained, but what is causation itself? That the concepts that scientists are using to try to do science, right? So in this way, philosophy is always moving or pushing the question of what is ultimate in that discourse, right? So in theology, people might believe in biblical truth or truth from religious scripture or revealed truth. But philosophers will ask, well, is God real? And they will openly question that. So philosophy is that intellectual space in the classroom where these ultimate questions kind of come to the foreground, which means that philosophers are insanely always scrutinizing each other. Right? You get that sense if you start reading philosophy, because philosophers are always scrutinizing each other. And the only real thing that philosophers really accept, if it's written, it can be logically challenged, right? And we challenge it through arguments, which is, maybe you want to do a separate video on the nature of arguments, of both deduction and induction, with those readings. But you get a sense, right, of trying to ask these ultimate questions. So if you recall, there's this sense of wonder that is in these readings. There's a sense of wonder that Socrates has, because he is really much concerned with going around the different groups in Athens and trying to find out. His ultimate question is, what is virtue? Right? So Socrates was most mainly concerned with trying to understand what the virtuous living entailed. And most of the early dialogues in Plato are largely interpreted as Plato revering his teacher Socrates. And so Plato wrote these dialogues of the images of Socrates. So Socrates is kind of a literary vehicle for the exploration of philosophical topics. And the assumption in the dialogues in that we're reading, like so the Euthyphro, the Crito, and the Apology, is that these are more earlier dialogues where we start to see Socrates and maybe Plato as being his student is kind of like a biographer. And so these are maybe the thoughts of Socrates. And then maybe Plato comes into his own in his middle writings, and then there's later writings. So typically when we study Plato, we study these early writings in almost every philosophy class because they involve themes of really easy as to what it is to teach philosophy, right? So what is philosophy? Well, from the philosophy videos in our series, we learn that philosophy is divided typically into about 4 areas, right? The first is epistemology, which asks the question, what is knowledge? The next one is logic, which is the study and evaluations of arguments. The next might be considered value inquiry or ethics, but I usually say value. In my classes, I usually say value theory because this involves areas of political philosophy or aesthetics, or philosophy of art, and also questions about what good living entails or what the good life is, right? So value theory, value-based inquiry, but typically in at least these readings it's called ethics, right? And then the final area is called metaphysics, which I've actually been thinking a lot about recently. But metaphysics is the ultimate concern for what's most real. Now, the real big philosophical phrasing here is what is real, or what is the metaphysical status of reality? What is reality itself? What does it contain? Does it contain angels? Does it contain God? Does it contain one substance? Does it contain many substances, right? Is reality mostly, are we living mostly in the mind of God and all material objects are presentations of God's thinking about them? Which is a real philosophical theory, which is like a philosophical divine matrix science fiction idea. Or, are we living in just a material physical world where there are no higher realities and the only knowledge I have is through my senses, which involves how epistemology and metaphysics sometimes unite, right? So you might have a theory about what you can know, which will influence what is most real. So you can see most of these areas of inquiry will overlap at some time, but for now, 4 areas of philosophy. How the tools of analyzing various arguments, logic, what can I know, epistemology, what is the best form of human life, ethics, which can involve political philosophy and ethics and social and political philosophy and other areas. And then, of course, metaphysics. What is real? And all of these questions are ultimate questions that none of the other 4 areas of the university or disciplines actually don't ask. They don't, so a scientist won't question the nature of causality. They just assume it head on to do experiments. And so the philosopher is always going a little meta. I mean, that's a little gamer talk, I know, but it's kind of an expression that has gained a little bit of common usage, right? It's sort of stepping outside of the assumptions that everyone's using. So, again, maybe I'll do a separate video about all the different Socratic dialogues, right? But what is philosophy? I think philosophy is the love of wisdom, but philosophy is asking questions. One thing to note is that it always seems to be being done, right? It's this form of inquiry that we do. It has no terminable end in sight, and there are various methods that philosophers have employed for the last 25 centuries, right? So an introductory course into philosophy our course is divided into these various areas. So we have a unit on metaphysics, like, so what is the self? Then we have a little bit of philosophy of religion, which goes into a little bit of arguments for God's existence, which again is like metaphysics. And then we're also asking questions of like what the good life is in this course too. So that's ethics, right? So all of these areas of concern are trying to get at the most ultimate questions that people just assume, right? So someone might say, well, the best form of government is a constitutional republic, and we have it. And Britain's a constitutional monarchy. I mean, people might get into a philosophical dialogue about which form of government is the best, right? So philosophical debates could be, what ethical theory describes the good life the best, right? And so how do we decide these issues if it's just this interminable, perpetual questioning that Russell talks about in that one reading? Well, the only thing we have is arguments. That's why in the Unit 1 section on the readings in the E-Core, we have a unit on arguments, right? And so that's probably deserving of its own video, but we use arguments. We make arguments to the effect of, well, these are the reasons why you should accept the conclusion God exists. Oh, well, no. You went wrong here, and this is the reason why. And so I guess philosophy is in the search of the best argument, even if we keep playing the game and the argument can't be found. Which actually feeds into a discussion of Bertrand Russell's practical men that we see in that one reading. So the practical men are human beings who can't see the intrinsic value of playing this sort of infinite, perpetual search for truth. They see no benefit to it. Whereas philosophers, this is just the sort of mindset that we all have, right? A couple of years ago, a friend of mine, she put it like this: philosophy is thinking in slow motion. I've always loved that definition of how philosophers proceed, because philosophical reading might just start off with trying to prove whether or not God exists, and that will, maybe there's two premises in the argument. So it's the design argument or the ontological argument. It just has two or three premises above the conclusion. But in order to just digest what those ideas are, you just proceed very slowly through this sort of methodical way of going about it. And, we keep having the same arguments. I mean, the free will debate probably starts, I would put it, somewhere around Augustine in the 4th century, right? The word for will in Latin, I think, is voluntatis, which comes from volition or voluntary, right? Volition, the will, right? And until we conceived of the faculties of human beings as having a will, there was no question of free will, and that question's been with us for a very long time. In fact, I have a friend who wrote a dissertation on the free will problem and continues to work on that problem. It's his most main concern in life, is trying to really think about whether or not his will is free. So again, philosophy is, in that opening post, I talked to you a little bit about trying to be moved by philosophical ideas in the same way that we might be moved by music or a movie that just sort of touches us in a certain way. And this philosophy is also an openness to inquiry, to engage in that type of questioning that ultimately is of a different disposition than Russell's practical men, right? If you've ever had an argument with someone, like a couple, your parents, a loved one, and you just keep reacting to each other, right? You don't, oh, you call me this, or you call me that. This is not what we mean by arguments per se, but it's also a sort of reactionary mindset, like the type of people that can only see the utility or instrumental value in something, But philosophy is like The Sandlot. If you've ever seen this movie, it's about a bunch of kids in the summer who just play baseball, and they continue the same game every day, and they don't stop playing the same game. And I often think of philosophy through the movie The Sandlot, because you just keep searching for truth. Even if we can't get there, the journey is more important than the end it would bring about, which is to say that philosophy is practiced for its own reward. And that actually feeds into this sort of idea that if we achieve intellectual autonomy from the authorities that tell us what is true, that our life will be more meaningful, our life will be more appreciative, and we will be more critical minds, right? Imagine American citizenry questioning authority. It's almost very Jeffersonian, actually, right? This disposition to question power. We see it in Socrates. And we see it in Russell. You know, if you learn about their biographies, Socrates was killed for basically annoying everyone in power, because the politicians would say, I know what justice is, and then you go, okay, well, what is justice? And they'd be like, and that's what basically the Plato dialogues, some of them are about. And Russell spent years fighting for peace, nuclear disarmament. And he did so out of a life concerned with reason. And I guess this is probably, you're going to pick up a lot of these readings argue for a reason-centered life, that human rationality is a source of emancipation and freedom. And I think that hopefully you get a taste for that in any beginning philosophy course, but if you take other courses, that there's a freedom to think for oneself. Because philosophy gives space to questions that we might not be free to ask in other environments. I guess the most common one might be like, is God real? Right? A lot of us may have been in church or temple or synagogue, and we find ourselves not wanting to rock the boat, and we're really wondering if we're just going through the motions, or is God real? And this is usually, when I talk to students, this is their first experience, this first philosophical moment. And philosophy will give space to all reasoned arguments. Not all opinions, but all reasoned arguments. Because there is the standard. Logic gives us a measure and tools to do philosophy, to play the perpetual game of the search for truth. Kind of like The Sandlot, where the kids keep playing. And they do so because the end of playing that game is intrinsically valuable. It's not extrinsically valuable. Philosophy majors, yes, they score very well on LSATs. They score very well on GMATs. And, it's a great major for, going on and doing other things. But when you talk to people about your major, what are you going to do? Well, I'm going to major in nursing, or I'm going to major in secondary education. Why? Because I want a job. Philosophy majors always have the attitude more like artists, typically. They're pursuing it because it's part of their passion. Which is to say, nursing and education can be a passion too. In fact, the best nurses and the best teachers don't approach those disciplines as if they want to just get a job out of it. Usually it's a passion rooted, it's a calling or vocation, the vocation to teach. And if you have this language of vocation, you're recognizing that there's something intrinsically valuable about playing this game over and over and over and over. So, with that said, philosophy is the perpetual intellectual use of the imagination to solve problems important to reflective human beings that cannot be solved by common sense, faith, or science alone. And if I had a definition for philosophy, that would be, what is philosophy? All right, stay tuned. I'll upload more videos. Until then, keep doing the readings, and I'm always available. I would recommend that you use the email inside brightspace/D2L and not my Savannah State email. That's the easiest way to come in contact with me. All right, take care.